As a longtime Resident Evil fan, I thought of dedicating the first video to one of my favorite villains of all time. Author link in bio. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and enjoy. Chapter 1. Lost in nightmares. The blood cascaded down his body as he screamed and choked. Jill, he yelled as loud as he could before hitting the ground. His strength had gone out of him. He had not even enough to turn his head and look upon his partner one last time. Ah! He screamed, wide-eyed and awake, his hair standing on end. What's wrong, Chris? Jill asked in a soothing voice. Chris turned to Jill. I had the same dream, again, he said with panicked streaks darting along his face. It's just a dream, Chris, a nightmare, everything is okay, I'll protect you, she said with a smile and kissed his forehead. Chris' mind had been a mess since his amnesia, at least that's what Jill thought, and Chris knew it. He didn't know how to explain it to her in a way that would seem rational, but he believed his dream meant something. A week passed. Chris had had the dream 7 times more. What could it mean? Wesker was dead. There was little threat to him and Jill, or so he wanted to believe. Chris set his gun aside and began wiping the zombie blood from his hands. He had cracked a few skulls that day with those 2 hands. Chris, you all right? Asked Jeffries, a fellow BSAA agent. Yay, why wouldn't I be? Said Chris. I don't know, it's not like you aren't performing. I mean, man, you're still the best agent there is. It's just, you look tired. Chris finished strapping his boots on. Ah, well, didn't have my coffee this morning, he said with a chuckle and a forced smile as he grabbed his keys. Gunfire. That is the sound both Chris and Jill awoke to. Get up, honey, yelled Chris as Jill leapt out of bed naked, the both of them dressed and strapped on their gear as quick as they could while hurrying to the sound of the shooting. Jill, said Chris, how many shots did you hear? 3, 4, said Jill. 5, said Chris, but not in rapid succession, they were one shot at a time, like a handgun. Just then Chris felt a rush of wind behind him. CHRIIISSS, yelled Jill as she began to unload a round of AK-47 ammo at her target. Chris whirled around as fast as he could and narrowly deflected the attacker. Well, good show, Chris, said the attacker. Wesker, yelled Chris and Jill at the same time as they trained their aim on the shadowy figure. Surprised. Hey. Oh Chris, did you really think a god would be killed by you? No Chris, my new world order is at hand, closer than ever it has been before. He laughed evilly and then disappeared quickly into the shadows. Jill turned to Chris, her face showing worry but more noticeably, determination. We need to let the BSAA know about this, said Chris. Chapter 2. A life worth protecting. You may now kiss the bride, said the pastor. Chris and Jill embraced each other with loving open arms and began to kiss. Jill slowly dropped the bouquet and using her now free hand caressed Chris' face. The church bells rang loud enough to draw a few zombies. Let's do this, partner, said Chris with a grin. What better way to start our new life together, laughed Jill as she loaded her machine gun. Buddha, Kraka aka Aka. Gunfire rang in the ears of everyone nearby as Chris and Jill, bride and groom, massacred every zombie coming their way. Let's finish off these bastards, it's almost dark out and I don't want to be out here all night on our wedding night, said Chris with a smirk. Jill rushed back inside the church and grabbed Chris his rocket launcher. Chris tossed aside his handgun, which was now empty, and grabbed the launcher. Let's do this together, Chris. Jill pressed her finger down on the trigger and Chris placed his over top. They pulled. Boom. A few hours later, after quite a good clean-up and dinner, Chris and Jill retired to their quarters. Jill slipped off her dress, along with the rest of her clothes. Come on, Chris, she said as she pulled him nearer her by his tie. Chris kissed Jill as he moved his hand down her body and sunk onto the bed with her. The lights dimmed into the bride and groom at that very moment. They were the only 2 people in the world. That night was the first time Chris had his recurring nightmare. Since then he was all but lost in nightmares when it came time to sleep. He couldn't close his eyes without being awoken by his horrifying dream. Chris set aside his coffee mug, remembering the happiest day of his life, the day he married his soulmate Jill Valentine, and on Valentine's Day no less. He knew he couldn't let the events of his nightmare come true in reality. It was more of a vision than a dream and he knew it. Wesker was back. He didn't know how, but he was back, and just that fact would threaten him and Jill as well as the entire world. Just then Chris heard a knock at the door. He unlatched the lock and let the man in. "Hey Leon, what are you doing here?" asked Chris. "Chris, I have to show you something," said Leon with a serious look on his face. "Well then, let's see it." Chris heard footsteps coming from behind Leon. Had he brought another guest? Just then Ada Wong walked into the room. "Ada, but, I saw you die," questioned Chris. "And so that is how Miss Ada Wong here is still alive. The Ada you saw die wasn't really Ada at all," explained Leon. "And you're telling me this because?" inquired Chris. "Chris, I know Wesker is still alive, and I think that this is how. The Wesker that died in Africa was just a clone." Chris angrily slammed his fist onto the table. "And if that's the case, Wesker has had 4 years of time to himself, with no interruption or hindrance from anyone while working on his plans," yelled Chris. The mud splashed under the thundering wheels of the BSAA's vehicles. Chris and Jill sat on separate cars manning 2 gunfire turrets. How was it that the BSAA had found Wesker so quickly? Could he have been that careless? No, Chris knew this had to be some sort of trick, and it looked like everyone else felt the same way. The airport wasn't far off. This was where Chris and Jill along with the other members of the BSAA were to get on a plane to Israel. This was where Wesker was said to be stationed. Chapter 3. Now bow down to your God. The silence was deafening as Chris and Jill walked through the blistering hot alleyways of Jerusalem. They had split up from the rest of the BSAA members to look for Wesker. The ground cracked under the tough boots of Chris and Jill. The sweat beaded and cascaded down their brows. They had been searching for quite a while and had found no trace of Wesker. Just then Chris and Jill heard a scream coming from a nearby building. They went inside and there was Wesker. "Wesker, this ends now," yelled Chris. "Oh, interesting, you found me. After all, that is what I wanted. Right here, right now, this is where you witness the birth of my new world and the beginning of my eternal reign as your God," laughed Wesker as he held up Jake. "Now let's see if my own son is worthy of living in that world, shall we?" he said with a devilish smirk. Chris and Jill watched as Wesker stabbed a needle into Jake's neck, a needle filled with Ouroboros. "No," yelled Jill. "Ha ha ha. Let's see how well he handles this, shall we?" chuckled Wesker. Jake collapsed, his body shaking, blood streaming from his eyes. "Oj, IW will kill you," yelled Jake as he struggled to his feet. "Oh, be quiet, you brat, you're on timeout," said Wesker as he smacked Jake aside, sending him spiraling into a nearby wall. Jake soon exploded, his muscle mass morphing and moving about, his eyes dialing in and out. He was a monster. "Well, well, well. What do we have here? You don't look too good," laughed Wesker as Jake lay on the ground having a seizure. Chris fired a magnum shot directly at Wesker's face, but Wesker snatched it in between his fingers. "Oh Chris, I am not the same as before. I am worthy. That bastard son of mine you tangled with was but a mere clone." Wesker suddenly appeared behind Chris and thrust his hand through his chest. "You are not worthy of my new world, Chris. Now die," Wesker said, and with a quick motion ripped his hand out of Chris' stomach. The blood cascaded down his body as he screamed and choked. Jill," he yelled as loud as he could before hitting the ground. His strength had gone out of him. He had not even enough to turn his head and look upon his partner one last time. Jill screamed for Chris, her warm tears staining the floor. She attempted to kick Wesker in the throat, but he responded with a quick reversal, grabbing her leg and sending his elbow surging through her knee. Bone marrow and scar tissue hit the floor. Jill's blood-curdling cry could be heard for miles. Wesker stood above the pile of bodies, the squirming, writhing filth. Jake was not able to handle the Ouroboros and had died in the corner, while Chris and Jill both lay on the ground gasping for breath and trying to hang on to life. "I have become even more powerful than before," laughed Wesker. "I have not rejected the Ouroboros. I am the only one worthy of being a god. Too bad you won't live long enough to see my glorious new world order." Chris grabbed his steroid injection and stabbed himself in the neck with it. He had used this when he fought Wesker's clone in Africa to bash his way through a boulder. Chris slowly rose to his feet, his eyes filled with hate and rage. "Ah, just like you, Chris, always a fighter. Let us see if you have the right to remain alive," Wesker said in a sinister voice as he dashed forward at Chris. Chris stood his ground and took a cobra strike to the gut. He didn't flinch although his entire ribcage shattered. Wesker waltzed over to Chris and showed him a picture of what was in store for the world. He had nukes, hundreds of them, filled with Ouroboros. While he was supposedly dead, he had infiltrated every country by way of deception. He had cloned the world leaders, presidents, prime ministers and used them to infiltrate every country. Wesker smiled. You shouldn't have thought me dead, Chris. You should have known me better than that. Now bow down to your god. He smiled, kicking his knee and making him drop onto both his knees. Wesker then grabbed Chris' head and injected him with the Ouroboros virus through his mouth. He then turned to Jill and did a windfall which splattered her brain matter across the room.